Thank you all for coming. Tonight, the West Lafayette Public Library has the special honor of hosting Bob Score to speak on historic preservation. Bob is a veteran architect and an expert in the field of historic preservation. He currently works with Harboe Architects, with which he has overseen many preservation projects at a number of historic landmark locations. This evening, Bob will be talking about what goes into historic preservation projects at different stages. He will use as examples the many Frank Lloyd Wright designed buildings he has worked on over the years, with a special focus on the recent work at SAMARA. This lecture is sponsored by the O'Brien Lecture Series, Indiana University Committee on Historic Preservation. It is co-sponsored by the John E. Christian Family Memorial Trust and Indiana Landmarks. I'd like to thank Indiana Landmarks for their help in publicizing this event, as well as for their great efforts to protect state historic sites and educate Hoosiers about the many interesting places that we have. To talk a bit more about Indiana Landmarks, please welcome Western Regional Director of Indiana Landmarks, Tommy Kleckner.
I was going to see if I could do this without the mic. You can all hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Please use the mic. Sorry, some people have hearing issues.
Okay,
Thank you.
I will use the mic.
Thank you.
Yep, not a problem. Well, Devin, thank you. Indiana Landmarks is delighted to be able to partner with the West Lafayette Public Library in this evening's presentation. Indiana Landmarks, if you're not familiar, we are the statewide nonprofit historic preservation organization here in the state. Founded in 1960, Indiana Landmarks is actually the largest statewide nonprofit of its kind in the country. Now, I'm originally from Iowa, so when I came to Indiana for grad school at Ball State, the master's program in preservation, I was like, how did Indiana get this organization? Well, it really, really was through solid early planning by its founders that has established the organization as the largest of its kind, both in staff and membership, and our capacity to really tackle the preservation issues and opportunities in the state. And again, being from Iowa, believe me, every time I travel back to my home state, I see what a difference it makes having an organization like Indiana Landmarks out there with local organizations, local elected officials, property owners, working to preserve the wonderful landmarks, the wonderful places that make Indiana a place worth caring about. So Indiana Landmarks, we revitalize communities, strengthen connections to our heritage, and save meaningful places. That's sort of our tagline. But there's so much more behind that. I'm pleased to be joined this evening by a couple of my colleagues. Sharon Gamble, Vice President for Development. And I want to encourage you, Sharon said, make sure, I encourage you over there at the end of the refreshment table, we have a box with little slips, and if you'd like to enter to win a year's membership to Indiana Landmarks, by all means, fill that out. Also pleased to be joined by Linda Eels, Associate Curator at SAMARA. Linda is that person now who knows SAMARA inside and out, upside and down, and we're as thrilled as we are that she's been with us. We're also sad that she will be retiring before the end of the year. So, but that doesn't mean she won't be done. You know, she'll be done with SAMARA. She'll still be involved. And then I see in the far back our colleague who has joined us, Mark DeLossi, Vice President of Preservation Services and Director of our Central Regional Office. So they're all here just to make sure I'm saying the right things. But Indiana Landmarks actually has a long association with SAMARA, and it was really through Dr. John Christian as he established the John E. Christian Family Memorial Trust to ensure the long-term preservation and protection and interpretation and use of SAMARA. It's Indiana Landmarks that manages that trust along with his daughter down in Texas. But Indiana Landmarks also manages SAMARA. And so you think, it's not that old. How much work could it need? Well, if you're familiar with Wright designs, they tend to have some issues, but Wright was pushing the envelope of design. And when you push the envelope, you push systems and you push drainage and everything else that goes into building a wonderful structure. So SAMARA had some needs, and Indiana Landmarks has been working to tackle those. So we've been really thrilled to be working with Harboe Associates, particularly Bob Score. So thank you so much. Glad you could join us this evening.
Good evening. Before I start, I just want to get an idea of who's all here. With show of hands, how many of you are engineers or architects or work within the design of building projects? Tradespeople? Owners of historic houses or properties? Passionate fans of Frank Lloyd Wright? All right, that gives me an idea of who's all here. I guess I'm all of those things. Sometimes regrettable to owning historic buildings. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about Frank Lloyd Wright, a little bit about SAMARA. I'm really going to go through an overview of what goes into approaching and doing these projects to understand and restore historic buildings, using examples from many Wright projects and some examples from SAMARA. And then at the end, I'll sort of have an overview of what was it that caused us to need to be involved at SAMARA and what are we doing there to solve some of its problems, to make it last for much, much longer. Up on this first screen, there's the old man himself over on the left, sitting over at Taliesin West. These are some of the projects our office has worked on. Over the last 20 years, we've worked on over a dozen sites designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. The upper image is SAMARA. For those of you that have not been there, if you haven't been there, it's just down the street almost. And it will be open again after the restoration. We'll be completing the restoration right around early December of this year. Over here, that is Unity Temple in Oak Park, Illinois. We in 2017 completed a $23 million restoration of Unity Temple. Inside out, everything from, we touched everything. We were involved with that project for over 20 years in the whole process of it. In the middle here is the dining room at Roby House in Chicago, down in the neighborhood of Hyde Park. That project, we were involved with the restoration of the interiors of the house. That was completed in 2018. Prior to that, there was earlier work done for exterior restoration. This building here, I doubt many of you are familiar with. This is the Cleta Humphreys Theater in Dallas, Texas. It's actually the only freestanding, dedicated theatrical arts building that Wright had built. He had designed this building and tried to knock it off all over the country. But Dallas actually built it. It was completed right at the end of his career in 1959. And we're involved in a major master plan, both for the restoration and adaptation of the theater as a performing arts space, which it is now, as well as additional theaters and theater arts education buildings on campus. Down here is Taliesin West. We've done a whole bunch of preservation planning work at Taliesin West and have completed designs for restoring Mr. Wright's office there. We're waiting for funding. In the middle on the bottom is Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin. We're doing a conservation management plan there and starting design and documents for the restoration of the Mr. Wright's bedroom wing. And finally, down in the bottom corner near me is the Emil Bach House. It was the last Prairie School house Wright did in Chicago up in the Rogers Park neighborhood. And that we spent a tremendous amount of money restoring. It's a tiny little, I think, maybe 1,100 square foot house that we spent about $1 million on. Fortunately, it was owned by Jennifer Pritzker, so that worked out really well. Tell you a little bit about myself, our office. My name's Bob Score. I'm an architect. I've been practicing for about 30 years. Have spent my entire career only working on historic preservation, mostly on National Historic Landmark and pretty prominent sites across the United States. Our office is Harboe Architects. We're in Chicago. We work all over the country, a little bit beyond, mostly on National Historic Landmarks, pretty exclusively on very focused historic preservation work. Really with the goal of preserving historic buildings and treating them with a very sort of historical and scientific accuracy. In addition to Wright's work, we've worked on work by Mies van der Rohe. We do a lot of work at IIT up in Chicago, as well as the Chicago Federal Center. This is the Illinois Supreme Court. This is the Grand Army of the Republic Rooms up in the Chicago Cultural Center. If you haven't been there in the last 5 months, next time you're in Chicago, definitely go through fabulous interiors. 3 rooms, I think we spent around $14 million. Utterly gorgeous. Tiffany designed interiors. We removed all the overpainting and conserved the original paint finishes. More traditional buildings. This is at IIT. This is in Humboldt Park in Chicago. We did the entire exterior of the Carson Ferry Scott building in Chicago. Other high-rise in Chicago. We were the architects for the restoration of the exterior of Wrigley Field. The Reliance building was one of the earlier projects that we worked on, as well as the collection of Wright buildings that I talked about earlier. So, historic preservation projects, they're actually quite involved and they have a lot of steps, many of which aren't similar to what's involved in more of a typical renovation or adaptive reuse project or a new construction project. So the first step is figuring out what the building is and what's its history and what are its needs. And so there's a whole series of sort of planning that involves research, understanding both the historical history of the building and the physical materials and nature of the building and how that's changed over time. There's a whole bunch of really scientific analysis done with microscopy and using petrographers and other material scientists to really understand the material properties. And there's working with the users of the buildings and the owners to figure out this building was built 100 years ago for a certain purpose. You're using it this way now. How's their needs changed and how does the building still provide that? Or does the building have to be modified to keep it functional and useful in the future? And then there's figuring out, well, we know all of this, what are we going to do about it? What are the solutions? And then also working with contractors and craftspeople to figure out how much all that costs. How do you phase that and actually come up with a plan before we ever really start doing any traditional architectural drawings. And there's different ways all of this gets done. They're usually in a relatively thick report that is somewhat expensive, but really valuable and allows for decisions to be made with all the knowledge you need. Some of the names of those things, the current trending ideas of conservation management plan, it really dives into the history, but it also looks in a more sort of holistic way at what are the values of the building, who are all the stakeholders, how do they view the property and its importance, and how do you manage change in the building over time. It's a much more philosophical approach to this. The Historic Structures Report is a more traditional version of that. It deals more with the facts and analytical ends of it, but doesn't get into how people perceive buildings and how different users may value it. Beyond that, there's a preservation master plan, which is a very sort of focused, looking to an end goal and just figuring out how to get there to some extent. And then there's a really light version, which is a condition and planning assessment, which is really just going in, what's the current condition of the building, what are its immediate needs, what does that cost, and how do we come up with a plan to address its most serious needs today. So I'm going to walk through those steps and talk about what's really involved with them. So research and understanding the building. This is a very, if you're a historian or have an interest in history, it's a really fun part of projects. It's really the first step in all this. And it's a combination of sort of sleuthing around archives and historic photos, as well as doing a lot of reading and understanding both the architect and the owners, the building, how it got built, and how it's changed. And we approached that by first diving into every possible archive we can come up with, and then once we talk to them, go into more archives. But we look for original drawings, as well as original specifications, which is like a written recipe of how you build a building, what all the materials are, how to put them together. And we also look, once we understand how the building has changed, so let's say a building was built in 1900, we want those original drawings. But if there was a major renovation to it in 1960, we also want all of those documents so that we can actually see how things were changed and how it was modified. So collecting all those different steps of interventions into the building with drawings and specifications is really important. We also go through photo archives, and we want to find photos. This lower middle photo is a photo of why Unity Temple is being constructed. And for Unity Temple, we found a whole series of construction photos, which is really helpful starting to understand where they actually placed reinforcing within the concrete. You could see it within the photos of the formwork. And so it gave us a roadmap of where to go look for stuff when we started actually touching the building. As well as early completed photos, we can compare that to today and see, oh, this has changed. This wasn't like that when it was built. This is what the landscaping was when this was originally built. This photo here, this is in 1970, they actually basically pneumatically hammered off all of the finished concrete off the Unity Temple and chopped it back about 2 inches, and then did a spray applied concrete coating over it. We have a whole series of photos of them doing that, so we understand all the work that was done in the 1970s, which really helped us when we were trying to figure out how to repair, because we were basically repairing the 1970s treatment at this point. The original building was already removed back 2 inches. And looking at other scholarly work, we don't always start from scratch. Unity Temple, Joseph Siri has written a very comprehensive history of the building. We'll take that and build upon it. We won't try to repeat what other historians have done. We may fact check it and make sure that if we find something, does everything we're seeing agree with what Joseph Siri found? Because there's these layers of history, and as you research it more, you learn new things. Once we actually understand the history of the building and how it's changed, usually the next step is we actually go out and spend a lot of time hands-on in the building. We crawl all over the buildings, basement to attic, roofs, places you're not supposed to be able to get into, that were never intended to be gotten into, where all the rats live. And we'll go through and we'll assess basically every inch of the building. Masonry surfaces, we'll go out with a small hammer and we'll sound the masonry surfaces to see if there's areas of delamination. We'll do similar things for interior plaster. We'll look for, as you can see on the upper left, things like cracks and displacement, weathered wood. These are all SAMARA photos actually. So, SAMARA, we had some garden walls that had started to topple over with some significant cracks. We had some minor masonry and lintel damage above windows and very worn exterior finishes on the woodwork. We had a lot of pattern cracking on concrete terraces adjacent to the wooden glass enclosure, which started giving us hints that there were other problems going on there. What was causing this to crack everywhere around the house? We bring in other engineer consultants. We examine the mechanical, electrical, plumbing, fire protection systems. How are they functioning? Do they meet the needs? In SAMARA, originally it all had radiant floor heating. That system doesn't work anymore, which is a real problem because that was the heating system for the house. Later, there's been added some forced air systems, but before we started the current project, there were multiple rooms in the house that had no heating or air conditioning, which is a problem for the house, both for preserving its physical materials as well as for people who have to sit in a room in the middle of winter that has no heat. On the far left bottom, that's some wood screens on some clear story windows. They had a lot of UV and water damage on the wood veneers. Some cracked plaster. Likewise, when we see major cracking in plaster, our first question is what is causing this? And this particular one, we ended up making openings and bringing our structural engineer and discovered that the crack in the bedroom was because the exterior cantilever was grossly understructured, and we had to restructure the exterior cantilevers to fix the crack in the ceiling. And other structural openings and rotted woodwork around the house. But we'll do this all over buildings, whether it's a high-rise or a single-story house. It's really going through and putting your hands on everything. And then we'll go back and we'll document all on that paper. This is a floor plan of Union Temple where we've mapped every crack in the flooring, as well as other types of deterioration. Different types. The red ones are very lineal cracks. The little squiggly lines are more like spider web cracks. But we'll do this and then we'll look for patterns and figure out what's going on as we repair it. Graphically seeing all these different types of deterioration together help us not just go in and fix the crack, but try to figure out why that crack happened so we can hopefully make it not come back. Or decide that not all cracks are bad. Some cracks we say, it's cracked. It's there. And then there's, what is this? Okay, so there's also the analytical sort of scientific end of this. And so in addition to just using our senses, our visually looking at things, poking it with an awl, we'll bring in other specialty consultants. And some of the typical ones on the far left is an example of historic paint finish analysis. And so we will bring in conservators that specialize in this, and they will come through and extract little sort of centimeter square little chips that collect all of the paint history. They will prepare those in the lab, cast them in resin, polish them, look at them under a microscope, and then the bottom left is basically probably around 40 times magnified image. Under the microscope, you can see every layer of paint. And so this is the finished layer here, and this is another layer, another layer. You can see every time this surface has been painted, what all the different colors are, and then eventually you get down here and say, oh, this is the good stuff. This is what I would like to do, and what was that? And then we can do addition. Once we know where we're looking, we use a different lab, and we can actually do a type of analytical analysis in the lab to figure out, was that oil paint? Was it a latex paint? Was it calcite paint? What were the minerals within the pigments? There's a high level of science that will allow us to sort of go back and figure out exactly how these coatings were made so we can replicate them. If needed. Not every paint finish has to be done that way, but when we were doing Union Temple, we spent a lot of that to figure out how was it made, what was in it, and how thick was it, how did it relate to all the plaster grains. Another example of that, the upper middle picture is the exterior concrete at SAMARA, which we needed to do some replication of. So we took some cores of that, sent it to petrographers. The petrographers look at it under magnification. They can tell us exactly what the concrete is made of. They can extract samples of all the sand and the aggregate. They can give us information about the colored topping, how it was actually built, and if there's any inherent problems with it that we can't see in our own eyes. And we get reports, and it helps us design either restoration treatments or how to replicate that. And finally down here also it's SAMARA. This is one of those window mullions where we're getting all this cracking. But if we want to, where we have wood, if we don't know what the species is or the species in cut, we can take a small piece of wood, send it to a wood scientist. They will look at it in a microscope and tell me that's Philippine mahogany. And it's cut in this tangential orientation. And so we use a lot of scientists to help give us real sort of factual analysis of historic materials. And then there's other types of analysis. So this is a diagram from the Cleta Humphreys Theater in Dallas. And what this is showing is the chronology of change in the building. And so, I'm just going to step over here, it's easier. You know, all this sort of black stuff, that's all original. This purple stuff, and the building was built in 59, around 1970, they re-raked the whole floor. They built actually wood risers over the original concrete risers because Wright's sight lines were horrible. All you saw was the back of people's heads. So they fixed it, kind of. You didn't see the back of people's heads anymore, but you lost some of the spatial geometry of the theater. All of this sort of hotter pink color, this is an interesting conundrum. That's all work. After Wright died, they immediately started making modifications to the building, and they hired Taliesin Architects, which was Wright's predecessor firm. So basically, Mr. Wright passes away, the exact same architects are sitting there in Wisconsin and Arizona, working in the same office. They hired that office, and they did a lot of additions and changes that were really hostile to Wright's original design. And as part of the restoration, we're actually recommending removing all of the work that Taliesin Architects did to get back to Wright's original building. It's challenging because Wright basically gave him a theater that seats 300 people without a lobby, because he didn't think you needed one. So one of the additions was a lobby. We'll solve that other way through putting a lobby underground and connecting it. And same with the floor rake. We're getting rid of all that. Instead of fixing it the inexpensive way, we'll end up shoring major parts of the building, removing all the concrete structure on the interior that's the raked floor, and lowering the rake into a utilitarian space below. It will be more elegant, but much more difficult. But graphically, we'll lay out what was the history of the building, how did it change, so we can understand all these different layers, and when we're walking through the building and say, oh, that's not 1959, that's 1983. And it helps communicate to everybody what's really going on. This is another one of those analysis diagrams. This is, we look at buildings a couple different ways. This is this is a diagram of integrity. And so integrity is what I'm looking at, really the original material. It's sort of the story back to George Washington's axe. If you replace the handle one time, you replace the head of the axe anymore, it really isn't George Washington's axe anymore. It looks just like it though. And so this is a map of integrity from Dallas. And the red portions are the areas with the highest integrity. And all that means is that this is still original material in spaces that no one has done anything to. Doesn't necessarily mean they're important, but they have a high amount of integrity. The blue is pretty compromised integrity. As you can see, that's actually the main house of the theater. The theater is the most important architectural space, but it doesn't have very good integrity. It's painted black, all the rakes are different, all the seats are gone. There's other spatial modifications that you walk in, you are not experiencing what Wright designed. So from an integrity standpoint, it's not very good. And then these yellow areas are even worse. They've blown stuff out and changed them. And then this really light color up here, it detracts from integrity. That's all the Taliesin architect work that we're recommending gets removed. And then this is the flip side of this. This has to do with how historically significant spaces are. So based on our research and understanding of how did these spaces or elements contribute to the architectural design and its importance, we'll do other diagrams that talk about the historic significance. And so here you can see the theater is of high historic significance. Typically public lobbies, public entries, sort of what the public experiences in a building like Cleta Humphreys will be the highest level of significance. Back of house spaces like the green room and changing rooms for actors, that's more secondary. It's a support type of space. It's still important, it's part of Wright's original design. These really highly significant buildings end up having a much higher percentage of significant contributing spaces than sort of your typical department store or a building that was made more to be multifunctional or a more common sort of contextual building. These masterworks, almost everything is important at the end of the day. Other things we look at are, I mentioned we talk about what are the needs, and that can change. Some of the times that's really simple. We're working on SAMARA. SAMARA's interpreted as a house museum. The needs at SAMARA are pretty easily accommodated within the design of the house that it was. You get into other sites like Unity Temple. Unity Temple was built in the 1890s as a church. It's still the exact same church, same congregation, never has changed. Its needs 100 years later are a lot different. And there's the way that they conduct their services, there's a large amount of music and theatrical performance, there's outside lectures, there's accessibility problems at Unity Temple, there's different types of religious education that was not done 100 years ago. So their programmatic needs are much different. And that becomes a real challenge. How do you satisfy all the needs of that congregation? Because if they can't use that building in a way that's good for them, they may move. And then you have an empty church, which isn't good for anybody. So satisfying all those needs is also important. And this is just an example of one of those types of things. This is a graphic analysis of the accessibility of Unity Temple. And this is sort of currently accessible space. One of the downfalls of Unity Temple before I did the work, this is where you sit for religious services. That's not accessible. You can sit over here in the cloister where you're sort of in a half basement looking in, but you can't actively participate in services at Unity Temple before the restoration. And there were other spaces in the building that were really important to how that congregation operated that you couldn't get to. And it was a problem for how that congregation operated. And then we look at different design options. So we have all this information. This is falling apart, this has been changed, these are your needs, and then we'll do studies for different solutions. It's usually, sometimes it's just one solution. The concrete's original, it's got problems. There's usually not that many options on what to do about it other than to restore it, at least if your goal is to restore the building. This is a project up in Waukegan, Illinois. The small building on the right of these images is original Carnegie Library. And it's now going to be home of the Waukegan Historical Society. Their program's much bigger than the Carnegie Library has been abandoned for 60 years. It's had no occupancy. So it'll be a very nice transformation just to have the building brought back and used. But the Historical Society needed significant more space to operate as a historical society. And so they needed a new addition. And so we came up with a whole series of that. This is 4 of probably 12 or 16 different rendered schemes of what would a new addition to this building look like. And some small ones, some big ones, depending on what program we really wanted to bring into the building. And how do we articulate that and relate it back to the original building? Is it more contemporary and modest? Do we start bringing in some of the historic elements into it, but not a complete copy? And we'll work through these with clients and local stakeholders, such as the landmarks groups in the city, and get feedback and understand what's going to be the best solution for all the stakeholders involved in the project. Once we know what we're going to do, then comes the bad news. We work with contractors and craftsmen on our projects. New buildings, typically you would just hire a cost estimator and they'll go through a chart and say, oh, here's the costs. Historic preservation work, it's really hard to do that accurately. And so we'll actually engage masons and carpenters and roofers and all the different trades that will be involved in these projects, walk them through our design solutions and work with them to develop budgets so that we have the best understanding that we can to advise owners. This was Unity Temple before it got marked up for inflation over 15 years. So when we did it in 2003, it was $11 million. And actually ended up being quite accurate if you projected out the inflation. And we'll also look at, oh, you don't have $11 million, you only have $2 million, so how can we phase this and what makes sense? You may want to do the pretty finishes first, but if you haven't done the roof that's leaking yet, that might not be a good idea. And if you have to dig holes all through the building to install new mechanical systems, doing that before you do this other stuff is probably pretty important, so you don't have to do things twice. So we'll walk through some, working with contract partners, what's the right way to break this up into multiple projects so that it's sequenced in a way that eventually gets owners to where they need to be. And this helps with capital campaigns. They know what certain things cost, when it's going to be. You're willing to give us $1 million. How would you like to sponsor restoration of the art class in the building or the mechanical units? So that sort of gets through this whole, what do we need to do and what's it going to cost idea. Then we get money, everybody's happy, and it's time to actually start doing that. And so the next side is actually developing all these ideas, documenting them, usually in drawings and specifications that go to contractors that they price and they build it. That sounds really easy, but it's not exactly. So, you know, some of these options, we know we want to improve accessibility and we're going to make these spaces accessible. Well, you get back to Union Temple and we said, well, there's all sorts of different ways to do this. We could just buy a piece of loose equipment that you push up and down the stairs and you don't have to modify the building at all. The architects like this idea, the congregation did not. There's a more sophisticated version of it. How about that one? No. They did end up buying one of these to get to some of the harder spaces to make accessible within the building without messing it up. But we also ended up doing some permanent stair lifts within the building. We also did schemes to actually add elevators within Unity Temple. And if you have to do that, where could you put them? And what does that mean? And then we helped them make decisions by, this, you can't see this, but it's blurry, but basically down this column, each one of these is a different design solution. Usually the first one is don't do anything. But we'll go through, and way down here you have add an elevator in Unity House, and this gives you access to all these things. And then we'll say this is what you have to do. These are all the pros and all the cons of these different things. The pros are the building's completely accessible. The con is we're going to have a very negative impact to the historic category in these specific spaces. And then also what are the costs for each of these options. And so it lays things out and it helps people make educated decisions as far as where is all this going to go. Because as much as we would like to always be making the decisions, we usually don't have that luxury. Usually it's all the stakeholders involved coming to some sort of consensus, unless we're really lucky. And this is another version of that. So I showed you earlier the accessibility schemes for Unity before we started. This is what we ended up with. So now with this scheme, all of a sudden the main floor of the congregation space is accessible. And before, none of the second floor was accessible. Now, all three upper level areas where they do religious education classrooms is accessible using various methods. This became accessible by putting a small chairlift on the stair. That's a permanent addition. These spaces became accessible by that loose piece of equipment that is motorized and will basically crawl up a staircase with a wheelchair on it and get somebody up there. There's a compromise in there, but the alternatives of putting an elevator in here and making all this work was really having a negative impact on this whole space, which is really important in the building. So it's finding the best solution for each particular case and each user group. The other thing that we do once we understand what we're going to do is we really start getting involved in taking portions of the building physically apart. So this far right image, this is Carson Perry Scott in Chicago. We decided we were going to put the cornice back on. The city of Chicago gave a huge gift to do this. The National Park Service contributed a lot of money to do this. So now we're us into what do we actually do? How do we do the drawings for this? How do we make sure this is going to fit? It was this corner, which is curved, is very complicated, and we quickly learned that, yeah, it's curved, but it's not just a circle with equally laid out things because it was constructed by hand. So we actually hung swing stages from the building and made a life-size template out of plywood with the drawings printed full size and adhered to them. And we would make the masons hang all this stuff up here, and then we'd take lasers and say, oh, nope, this one doesn't fit. And we'd take measurements, we'd take it down, we'd do a whole other set of templates. And by the time we did this like the fourth time, it fit. That seemed really onerous and expensive, but doing it with plywood and paper was much less expensive than having everything made with the final materials, coming out during construction when no one has time for it to be wrong and saying, oh, it doesn't fit. So we'll do stuff like that. Some of it's more typical. Here's an opening in a terracotta facade. If we see cracks and deterioration and we know we're going to be replacing some terracotta, we also have to fix why it's cracked. So we will bring in masons while we're doing the drawings for construction and have them actually remove portions of the terracotta masonry carefully. And we'll be able to see all the concealed steel in there. Is it just a little bit corroded and we can clean it up and paint it? Is it so corroded that it's not there anymore and now I have to remove more stuff and completely replace all of that? And what's the best way to re-anchor the new replacement materials? So we'll do this really invasive partial surgery in representative portions of these buildings so that we really understand what's going on, so when we get to construction, we usually, hopefully, have gotten it right. And because fixing things in construction is much harder than fixing it beforehand. This is another area. This is at Carson Curry Scott when we were recreating this cornice. This whole pier is on the interior, but it was originally part of an exterior loggia at the top of the building. It was all concealed with plaster. We didn't know it was there. We were out there poking around and we're like, oh, let's make a hole here. And we made a hole and we found this original terracotta. It was the only original terracotta from that portion of the building because it was all removed in the 1940s and thrown in probably Lake Calumet. So by finding this, we actually knew exactly what the ornament and coursing dimensions were here. And even better, you can't see it in this photo, but we actually see ghost lines of where the cornice came into it. So we knew exactly where the cornice was, and at least part of its profile until we got to the part that was in Lake Calumet. But, so opening things up, we discover things. There's a lot of hidden secrets in these buildings, and you don't find them until you start going and taking stuff apart. And we try to do that while we're working on paper. More advanced, I talked a little bit about the lab analysis. This whole slide is just about trying to design the paint finishes for Unity Temple, which took us 3 tries over about 4 years. And they look really simple, and they are. But it took us a long time to figure out how simple they were and how to reproduce them. Typically, we'll look at paint cross sections around magnification between 15 and 40. Unity Temple, we ended up getting the magnifications, I think, around 100 times. And the reason is because the original paint finishes at Unity Temple are extremely skinny. And until you get to that point, you're seeing 2 or 3 layers and you don't realize it. And we kept making that mistake. The other weird thing at Unity Temple is the paint didn't cover everything. So there's this plaster that had this exposed sand aggregate. And when they originally painted it, the paint just sits in the little crevices of plaster but doesn't cover the sand particles, which means almost everything you see is actually the color of the sand and not the paint. And so once we realized that, then we had to very accurately take apart the plaster so that when we did new plastering, we matched the sand size, the sand color. We figured out a way to actually apply that plaster so that the sand was exposed to the same extent that it was originally. We would paint samples of this, and then we would take those samples and send them back to brand new samples, send them back to the paint analysis people to cross-section to come in the microscope. The goal was if microscopically my new finishes matched microscopically original ones, then that's probably what it looked like. Because at Unity, we were not able to successfully expose finishes because of the original paints were an oiled paint. We just really couldn't get the other coatings off of them. This is a trial of doing all those exposures and different ways of, this one's accurately replicating the paint. This was, oh, we don't have all that money. What if we just try to fake it out and paint over the existing paint in a way that looks like it? And so that was this version. This was exposing the original finishes, but we couldn't get all the paint off, so it looked really dirty. And we worked with all these craftsmen on this. This isn't art, this is a combination of plasterers and painters and scientists.
Is that you in that picture?
That is me in the middle. Yeah, that's me looking with a little magnified loupe, telling my painter, there's too much paint right here. He thought I was nuts. But yes, it was that level of scrutiny, both when we're doing mock-ups as well as during construction. We're walking around with that stupid little thing, reviewing all the paint with a little magnifier. Painters didn't like that. We do a lot of samples and mock-ups, which new construction has some of that. Preservation work, if it's successful, has a huge amount of samples and trials and mock-ups. When you're trying to accurately match original materials and finishes, we almost never get things right the first time when we try to do samples. The far left picture, that young kid there, that's what's his name? Blake Rago from Ward, who did all the shotcrete repairs for us. Blake's dad did all the shotcrete work in 1970. So that was cool. And they still had stuff in their shop from that project, so that helped us. Blake's holding up a little triangle of shotcrete. That's a sample saying, with this mixed design and this finishing, can I match the area next to where we're doing repairs? We learned a couple things in that. One, we ended up doing probably 50 different samples of shotcrete mixes to match the shotcrete Union Temple. That was fine. What was more unfortunate is we discovered the color of Portland cement that goes into making this stuff, the color of the material actually changes every time they make a batch of it. And so basically every time we would get material, it was a different color. And so you can solve that by pre-buying it. That wasn't a problem for us. The problem was in 1970, they didn't care. So there's like 5 different colors of shotcrete on Unity Temple, depending on where on the building you are. So we actually had to match samples for all 5 of those. And then Blake would say, oh, it's this one over here, and it's this one over there. It became very difficult. But the standard for Blake was, when we're standing out on the street, we don't want to be able to see the repairs. They had to be good enough to be invisible. And if we could see them, he had to chop them out and do them again. So lots of trials. That's me many, many years ago in the middle, holding up a sample of glass fiber reinforced concrete, which was going to be the new cornice for Carson Perry Scott, next to an area of cleaned original terracotta. And we went through a couple dozen different mixed design colors of GFRC until we found the sample we thought we liked. Once we think we like something, looking at this little piece is deceiving. So we made a whole big piece of the cornice and we temporarily hung it up here in the air. They put the first one up and we said, that's too yellow. So we had them do another one, and they actually made 3 more of these big pieces, brought them out on site, hung them all up in the air, and then we came out and said, let's use the one on the left. But it's the same thing. If you don't do this level of trial and error understanding, you're almost always going to be wrong. If you don't keep doing that before you actually get to the real construction work, then the whole cornice on Carson's would be too yellow. And right now it looks really good because we went through all the expense and time, but all of that takes a ton of time. And if you don't leave yourself a very large window to go through these trials and mock-ups and samples, if you try to do it during construction, it's torturous because no one has patience at that point. We just got to get it done. A couple examples of other ways that we work with artisans to reproduce stuff. These are light fixtures from the Grand Army of the Republic Hall in the Chicago Cultural Center. All the original light fixtures are gone. They were all custom. It was nice. We found all the original drawings that Tiffany and Studio did of the light fixtures, and then We also found the historic photographs that looked nothing like the photograph, the drawings. And we found the bids from the original construction in which the light fixture supplier had a proposed alternate for all these fixtures without any drawing documentation of what they were. So, given that, we basically had this photo and this photo to replicate all these fixtures. Which they look really good. It's a pretty good photo until you actually start to try to make that. What size was it? What do these leaves really look like? What are all these other little gobbledygook things? And so we do a couple things to do this. One is we really study these photographs under magnification and manipulating colors and shading to get as much information as we can. We will put these into three-dimensional models of the space and align them with historic photographs, because then we can scale them. And I can say, oh, this ring here actually is in the ballpark of about 6 inches. Well, once I know that, I can start proportionally building this fixture. I may not know what every single thing is. So we get to these big leaves. So I'm like, oh, what's that? We really couldn't get it out of the photos. So then we start going through, well, let's look at other period light fixtures from the time. So you start researching bronze acanthus leaf light fixtures, and you spend a week doing that. And you pull up every bronze acanthus leaf light fixture you can find off of Google. And this was one I found. It was really pretty close. It's small, but it was a really similar fixture, at least enough that I could work with a sculptor and say, I'm trying to do something like this, I think. And this is still a photo, but it's much more illustrative for me to have a conversation with an artist than just saying, oh, it doesn't look, that doesn't look like what I think I'm seeing here. And I'll say, well, what do you think you're seeing there? I don't know. Sometimes we don't find the elements, and so we end up doing our own interpretive sketches of these things to communicate. Basically, we need to communicate to the craftspeople and artisans enough so that they can build this stuff for us. Sometimes it's very specific, sometimes it's a really horrible sketch like this one. Once we give that information to the artisans, then the fabricators or the artisans will start preparing the drawings that they will use to build this. So we have this like loose thing of these pictures and stuff and say, make something that looks like that. They'll come back and do this whole detailed set of drawings, and we'll do a drawing of every one of these pieces. And they'll send them to us, and then we'll give them all these comments. I don't like this piece is wrong. And there's a lot of back and forth. For these, there's different ways to work with artists. These fixtures that we did for the Grand Army of the Republic, this is the first time we've done this. The fabricator actually used a 3D animator artist, and they built all of the fixture pieces. That drawing previously did all these pieces. Every one of those pieces they built as an individual piece in a computer model. And they were in Canada somewhere, and we were in Chicago. And every week we'd get together, both me and a couple of my historians who are much smarter than me, and other people on my design team, and then the sculptor and other people. We'd get together once a week, and we would do basically artistic critiques of their models. And so, we started out these gray images out of the computer model, and we could spin this thing around and zoom in and zoom out, and we could look at each piece, and we would say, this leaf is too flat. That's sort of like Goldilocks. And this leaf is too curly. And we keep saying, and say, well, I don't know what that means. And I go look for more pictures from 1920 or something and say, I mean like this. Eventually, we get to the point where we say, yes, we like the computer model. Once we do that, then they print the computer model out on a 3D printer in foam. And we build the fixture out of foam. And then sometimes we say, that's good. Or sometimes we'll say, now that we see it, I don't like this leaf, let's start over on that. And we'll go back to the computer guy and he'll remodel it and we'll print another one in foam. And so there's this back and forth, because somehow you have to get the artist to see what you're seeing and then build it. Whoops. Hold on. Yeah, that's the slide. Maybe not. Nope. Okay. So this is sort of the before and after. This was this photo of when the building was originally there. We got very lucky to find this. The interior, the lead architect was Shepley Bullfinch out of Boston. I have spent time previously in my life in Boston, so I knew people at Shepley. We didn't have any good images of this. All the published images have been screened, so you can't use screened images to zoom in on because you just get a bunch of little pixelated dots. So I called Shepley, and it turned out they had all the original negatives and prints in their archives, and said, "Oh, we'll scan them and send them to you." So that was very fortunate. But so this is the space beforehand. This is the image we used to proportionally measure all this stuff, and then this is the after photo. So if you go to the Grand Armory Public Rooms, this is the main memorial hall now, and these are those chandeliers. They turned out really beautiful. I won't say they're a perfect replication, but they're really pretty close. I couldn't make them better. If I had to do them again, they would look the same way they look, at least with what I have today. A different way of working with sculptures. This is the cornice at Carson Perry Scott. That image on the far left, that was the clearest image that we had of the original ornament on Carson Perry Scott. And so we had to replicate that based on that photo, basically. So how do we start that? Well, we sort of build some context. So the next image next to that, that's other terracotta ornament on Carson Perry Scott. So we went through and did a whole inventory of all the ornament on that actual building to at least understand what was the family of ornament that was also used on the stuff that I don't have anymore. And then, we expanded that. So this is the cast iron ornament on Carson's. Very different execution of cast iron than terracotta. You can't get undercuts, and there's other things in this fabrication process that require the ornament to be different. We looked at other Sullivan ornament. These are plaster panels from the Garrick, I believe. But basically, any place that Sullivan did ornament, we went and looked at it, and if we thought it had relevancy to Carson's, we collected images or physical samples of it. This was a really cool, I don't even remember what this came. This may have been unbuilt from Sullivan. I forget where it's from, but this is a really interesting relationship to this because the panelization of this had a lot of similarities to what Sullivan was doing here. We'll also go back and look at the original drawings. We have all the original drawings from Sullivan. It should be easy. Except Sullivan designed all the masonry in carved marble. And then there was a stonecutter strike during construction. They switched it all to terracotta, which allowed Sullivan to totally change the ornament design because terracotta is much more expressive and fluid than carving marble. And he had Christian Schneider to sit there and carve all those wonderful ornament for him. So we knew the basic proportions and geometry of this thing, but we knew nothing about the ornament. So what did we do? We drew what we do. We drew the basic proportions and geometry of this stuff, and we sort of made a puzzle. And so we need a whole bunch of these pieces and 37 of these pieces, and these are the capitals. And so we dimensionally put constraints. These are the dimensions of what these things are going to be to make them fit on the building. And this is the basic geometry that we can see from photos of the types of elements on there. We just don't know what those elements look like. So then we hired a team of artists. For this one, we hired Conservation of Sculpture and Object Studio just outside Chicago, and they gave us a team of sculptors and artists. We started out on these large, full-size drawings that they were developing. They're beautiful, but we were extremely unhappy with where these were going. We couldn't communicate to them what we wanted because we just had that lousy picture to point to. And so they couldn't see it, and we couldn't say it wants to be like this. So we basically tossed all these drawings aside, and we decided to just work in clay. Well, let's just keep sculpting it in clay until it's right. And we brought in great experts. This gentleman here in the brown suit coat, that's Tim Samuelson, cultural star in the city of Chicago, one of the national preeminent experts on the ornament of Louis Sullivan. I had great access to him. He lives in my building. So I would take Tim to the sculpture studio every week. And this is a series of progressions. So this is sort of how we started. They took that geometry, laid it out in clay, and we knew we had all these negative zones that were leafy or tenuous or something. And we started building it up, and then Tim had great historical knowledge of how Sullivan did this at the Garrick and how Sullivan did this at the Guarantee Building. And we had all those examples too, but he really got it. And so having our office, in our opinion, and his, to be able to continually talk to these sculptors, eventually we get to this, which probably looks nothing like what Louis Sullivan actually did. This is what we did. But based on what we had, this is our best interpretation in 2006 or whenever I did this, of that. And as you experience the building, it's a good experiential interpretation of Sullivan's cornice. I would never say that that's Louis Sullivan's work. That's my work. And then after we go through all this stuff and develop how to do it and the artwork, then we do drawings, we do specifications, it becomes much more like a typical project. And that gets bid. And at the end of the day, in case I didn't stress this, the only way all these projects work isn't the architects, and it's not even Louis the scientist, it's all the craftsmen and artisans. If you don't have good craftspeople and artists on these projects, you will never get, a very good artist can take a really bad architect and make their work correct. The opposite doesn't really work. I've had artisans quit and leave and never come back, but it's really hard to make someone that doesn't know how to do this get the skills to do it. They just get frustrated and leave. But all these people worked with me multiple times on these projects, and they're the real reason this work is as good as it is. Really quickly, I wanted to run through SAMARA. Just give you sort of, since it's down the street, that's kind of where we're at. I want to give you an idea of tying all this back into what are we doing at SAMARA. So if you're not familiar with SAMARA, it's a Usonian house designed by Lloyd Wright for Dr. John Christensen here in West Lafayette. It was originally constructed in 1956, and if I make any mistakes, Linda, feel free to correct me, but I'm not going high into this history. If you have history questions, just go over there. It's an interesting house because when they commissioned Wright to do this, they didn't really have enough money to build it, at least not the way Wright designed it. And so Wright understood this, and they constructed the house, and Wright gave them sort of this whole portfolio of, when you have money, then add all the copper fascia to the eaves. And when you have money, add this. And they actually did that. It's really the only example of that I've really seen in Wright's work, where an owner had a portfolio and over a period of many years gradually kept completing the work to what Wright designed. Fabulous. And these are the exterior elevations. This is the floor plan. If you're familiar with the house, you come up this driveway. There's a loggia here. You come into this entry. There's this beautiful living room with a sunken seating area with this beautiful full-height wooden glass wall that looks out onto this terraced walled garden. And then you step back up and there's a small dining area, more wooden glass, and then out here is a little lanai garden. So I'm going to talk about projects at this living room terrace, at this lanai garden wall, and mostly this wooden glass wall that enwraps the house. Here's some historic. These are current exterior images. This is on the left is by the main entry, like most of Wright's work. A little bit of discovery, somewhat modest on the entry side, and then as you come through, you discover these great spaces and everything else around it. The house is built up on a hill. This is a view looking up the hill. This is that living room garden terrace. Over here is the lanai garden. More existing photos. This is the lanai garden with this red-colored concrete paving, wooden glass exterior walls, similar construction over on the entry terrace, the living room terrace, and some shots of the interior. This is the living room, the wooden glass enclosure looking out into the terrace garden, little transom lights with this beautiful wood screen. The whole house is based on the motif of SAMARA, which is a winged sea. And that gets executed through the house in many ways, the traceries within these windows, the design of this rug. Much like Wright, he carried these organic themes throughout the architecture. This is the dining area, as well as the wooden glass walls that go out onto the lanai garden. So we got there, and it's a great project. It's actually funded by the Save America Treasures grant program, which helped cover some of the costs for this. We started this project, as I talked earlier, we do different levels of studies, from these really complicated conservation management plans down to more of sort of like a condition assessment and planning and master plan. This was like in between the conservation assessment, planning document and the master plan, to really, what are the needs of the house, how do you address them, and what does it cost, and what do we do about it next? So these are some of the conditions that we found when we first got there. The entry terrace was one of the bigger ones, and probably why they actually, one of the main reasons that this project started. There was significant settlement and cracking. This is the terrace paving on the entry terrace. This is like a 2+ inch drop in the paving. Everything was moving a lot. This is the wall of that garden that's going good, and all of a sudden it drops off and just keeps dropping, and then sometime previously someone put this big steel plate over this so you wouldn't see the big crack there. And to help support this column that was right where the big crack was. Other things were happening here. The overhangs were significantly sagged. By these overhangs sagging, the doors, the wood doors that go out on this terrace, many of them, or most of them, could no longer open because they were binding, because everything was moving. The floor was going down, the roof was going down. It's all going the same direction. Significant amount of wood rot. This area of deteriorated at the wood timbers, wood mullions, we see consistent cracking and splitting of these and bulging, and then cracks within the concrete, which started us to suspect that there was interior steel hidden within this wood cladding. The steel was corroding, and it was the concealed steel that is busting all the concrete and deteriorating wood. But we have suspicions. So next thing we do is we start taking things apart, which we talked about. We opened up areas of the exterior soffits and exposed the framing, and we realized, wow, all these cantilevers are really sagging because the original structural support for these was not sufficient in some cases, or what Wright asked them to do, they didn't actually fully execute. They didn't bolt this beam into the masonry like he asked them to do. It's just sitting next to it. And so already going like this. We went out and we dug holes and we looked at foundations. This whole thing's sinking. Why is it? Well, that there is the footing. Grade's like right here. The footing's about 4 inches. And it's about 8 inches below ground. So that was bad. But then there's this drain pipe running right next to it that has a big hole in it. And so there's a big hollow area underneath this because there's a drain pipe next to a footing that doesn't really exist, washing all the soil off from underneath this terrace. So now we have an idea of why things are happening. Then we also have to figure out how to fix it. So this house is on a hill, the soils aren't very good. So we hired a geotechnical engineer. He had drillers come out, they drilled deep holes into the soil and collected samples, and they were able to say, well, the bad news is the first 6 feet of soil is garbage, but once you get below that, it's good. Which meant that as we started designing, we have to address these footings. What kind of footing do we have to put there? I need to get a footing that gets down to good soil that I can bear on so that this doesn't happen again. So it's a lot of the sort of detective work and investigation. There's also science in this. So we were going to be doing rebuilding of brick masonry and some selective repointing. So we had to understand what the mortar was. So we collected mortar. Our petrographers looked at it and said it's made of this type of cement and lime binder, and it's got this size of aggregate, and they digested it and gave us a little bag of sand. And then we take that bag of sand and go to someone else and we say, find a way to match this sand, and we look at it with microscopes. And what we do is we end up with a recipe to replicate this stuff accurately so that it looks like it originally did. And also photographers tell us if there's any inherent problems. This particular mortar in our house was extremely hard. It's a very high cement ratio mortar, so we actually chose to modify the mix design of the mortar so that we weren't repeating inherent problems within it in the new work. So sometimes we won't exactly replicate if there's a good reason not to. We also went all over the place and collected different bricks until we found a brick that was a good match of this, because there's a lot of spalled bricks because of my very hard mortar. So we had to buy a bunch of new brick. And so we kept looking until we found a good match for brick, and we were able to source that. And that's just getting on the phone and calling every brickyard and saying, send me more bricks, until you find something that matches. And then we worked with the masons. They had to figure out how to take all this apart and salvage as many bricks as we could. And so they did different trials for that. And then we had them do samples and mock-ups. Before I let you work on the building, over here, rebuild a portion of wall, show me that you can actually put this together the way I want, tool all the mortar joints the way I want, and I'll say, oh, I don't like the profile of this mortar joint, make it a little deeper, do this, and they'll correct that lifetime while I'm standing here, so if we come to an agreement, this is what I want you to do, and then they do it. And then this is some of that repair work in place. On the far left was excavating much further down to put in foundations for this terrace wall, pouring new concrete footings, backfilling the area that was really lousy, that's going to be underneath the concrete with new crushed stone. The steel supports that were holding us up that I talked were corroded. We actually shored all this up. They were steel T's. They were in decent shape, but the bottoms were moderately corroded, still usable. So we shored everything, we took them out, removed the corrosion, had them hot dip galvanized, and then reinstalled them, and then we'll reclad them. And soon they'll be placing the concrete back. We're working on finishing up the final design details of that. And then a lot of wood repairs, and so rotted wood we replaced. We used a different species that's not as prone to rot, weather better. Exposed cladding, which was mahogany. We went and we found as close of a match to Philippine mahogany, which you can't buy anymore. So we found the closest mahogany we could, use that for replacement exterior cladding material. This is the lanai wall. Similar problems. This is that brick wall that was leaning way over. We dug some holes. We found the footings. The footings here were decent. There was a lot of water down here, so the drain tiles weren't functioning. And there's this whole row of trees here, which were basically pushing the wall over. And the trees weren't originally part of Wright's landscape design. They were added later, which was helpful, because the trees aren't going to be there anymore. So we removed the trees. We dismantled this whole wall. We did further inspection of the concrete footing to make sure that it was as good as we thought it was. And then this wall's getting rebuilt, basically, with additional reinforcing added in, and tying it back in, and using as much salvage brick as we can, and where we can't, using a really good match. I mentioned a little bit about the red concrete. There's a lot of red concrete on the outside of this house. It's the exact same red concrete that's on the inside of the house. It's sort of a seamless transition. The concrete, it is red, but the concrete they actually place is not. So the concrete they place is a regular gray concrete, and then there's a finishing layer on it. It's called a dry shake hardener, which all that means is when the concrete's still wet the day they place it, they spread this red powder on it, and then they trowel it into the cement paste on the top of the surface. So that red coating is only that thick. So this is more petrography work. So we took this core and sent one of those to petrography. He sectioned it, polished this, looked at it in a microscope, and he was able to tell us how this was made. This is a very thin layer of dry shake hardener. These are the properties of it. Appears to be similar to collodium hardener, which is actually what's Wright put on the drawing saying to use. So that was good. And then there's this 1.5 inch layer that has no big stones in it. It's just sand and cement binder. And then below that, there's another slab that has big rocks in it. And so that helps us understand how to replicate all this stuff. Then we worked with a supplier, and they made, maybe 100 of these little Petri dish pucks of different slate shades of, first we matched all the sand and got that that part's easy somewhat. Then getting the color right, they're custom blending these colors to get the best match we can to the original. And so after many, many dozens of these, and we look at it and say, that one's no good, that one's no good, that one's okay, but not perfect. I want it a little bit redder or a little bit less red. And they keep tweaking that, and over multiple months, they finally get something that we like. And we'll say, that puck is the good one. Then we give all that information and materials to the concrete guy, and he will actually replicate that on site in a loose area using all the finishing and placing techniques that he will actually use in construction to confirm that what we did in that little petri dish in the lab actually works and looks the way we want it to when we do it using real construction people. And the methods they're going to use. There's also wooden paint finishes. I'm not going to dwell too long on this. A lot of faded, deteriorated clear finishes, some delaminated veneers, chipping paint. On the interior, we had paint and plaster. I talked a little about the crack that I had to restructure the entire cantilever for. We were fortunate when we did paint analysis. We went through and collected paint samples, looked at in the lab. That's here. We actually found that in one of the rooms in the house had never been overpainted. The rest of the house had been overpainted once, and the color's slightly different, and the application of the finish is different. The original plaster was similar to Union Temple in a way. It was a plaster with sand in it that was troweled, that exposed sand, and then they painted it. And the second time they painted it, they knew if they painted it again with just paint, they'd start obscuring that texture. So they actually took paint and added sand to it, and it's a sand-filled paint finish, which looks very different. And that's what's applied throughout the rest of the house. So we understood all this from the paint analysis, and we knew this is the original finish, this is what it looked like, this is the second finish, this is what we looked like. They'll match all those colors for us. Same with all the paint on the metal elements on the outside. If you're very familiar with SAMARA, when you go by next, you're going to see that the metal gate is a much different blue than you saw last time. And that's because when you look at the paint chip, this is the original blue, and this is the blue that was there last. And so when we repaint it, we're going back to this one, because that's what was there. So we do discover stuff and things change as we get this scientific level of information. And this is stripping and refinishing all the wood finishes using a different finish that was out there last time. The last one was like a urethane top coating. This is more of a penetrating finish similar to the original. So we'll have both a similar appearance to the original as well as it will weather better than what was out there last time. And we do a bunch of samples to make sure we like them. And then finally there's the brick driveway. I'm not going to talk much about this. We surveyed the whole thing. We found out that they just put bricks on top of dirt, which is not a good way to do a driveway. It's cheap, but what you end up with is all these wavy ruts and stuff. Everything moves, and then there's lots of spalls and cracks. And so we lifted all the brick. We salvaged, this is the guys lifting all the brick. They pick it all up by hand. The good ones go in here, the bad ones go in a pile, they go in a dumpster. We salvage as many as we can. We find the best match we can. Buy, I think on this job, 6,000 new brick pavers to replace all the damaged ones. And we changed how this is set so that it's more to current standards for how you build a brick driveway. A little brick curb, a whole bunch of crushed stones, some sand, pavers. It'll do better in the winter conditions. It'll do better with cars going over it. It will drain, so it won't spall and crack like the previous pavers did. That's what's happening in SAMARA. We're doing other things. There's mechanical upgrades. We're going to try to get the radiant floor system working. We're adding additional forced air units very carefully in the house so that they're not visible as much as we can, so that those rooms that currently don't have any conditioning, the radiant floor repairs we know won't last forever. So when it stops working again, there will be heat and air conditioning in those other rooms. Upgrading the electrical system so it's safe. So I'm sorry I went a little bit long, but I have plenty of time for questions if anybody has any.
I have a couple of things. Crystal Bridges Museum relocated a ride home from New Jersey to Arkansas. If you could speak a little bit about the relocating of some of these houses?
That particular project I'm not familiar with, so I can't. I have moved buildings before. Sort of the two topics I'll touch on. Relocating structures, at least from a historic preservation standpoint, is usually an option of last resort. Buildings have a lot of their importance and significance is related to their context and the site that they were built on and how it relates to it. And so when you move a building, you lose all of that. But there are times where it's necessary. It's either move it or it's gone. Moving buildings actually is a relatively easy, straightforward process. There's people that specialize in it. They're very good at it. It's expensive, but they basically build a whole structure network underneath it and then excavate, lift it up with jacks, roll it down the road and set it back down. It looks very complicated, but it's actually, moving is the easy part in some ways. Because you still have to restore it once it gets there.
And the other thing is, when looking at the room here, I'd say the average age is 60. What's that say about the future of preservation?
Oh, I can speak to that for a moment. It's really, I'm sorry to interrupt, but my daughter is at University of Cincinnati studying interior design right now. And that is one of the main things that she would like to do with her degree.
That's
when she's
great.
finished. She grew up in probably Lloyd Wright houses, touring and things like that. And I mean, she's very interested.
That's great.
I don't see the challenge being in the historians and preservationists and the architects, engineers and scientists. Those people, they keep coming and there will likely foreseeable future be a good crop of them. Actually, they keep coming out smarter and smarter. I can't do anything anymore because all my young people are smarter than me. Where there's two ends that are challenging. One is in material availability. We see, when we did Union Temple, all the art class in Union Temple came with zinc canes, which is basically folded zinc sheet metal, as opposed to what most people are used to, which is a lead cane, which is a cast lead. When we started Union Temple, there was only one manufacturer of zinc cane, period. And shortly after we started the project, they went out of business. And so we had no source for zinc cane, and we spent like $80,000 having someone switch over their production that made something else to make zinc cane. That isn't a typical available response. We were fortunate through our donor to do that. But we're starting to see the lack of availability of certain materials and processes just because technology moves on and it goes away. And the other is really specialized artisan craftsmen. Continually gets harder and harder to find. Depends what market. If you need a mason in Chicago, there's a lot of really good masons in Chicago. You need a really good carpenter to do preservation work in Chicago, there's probably less than that I would trust with projects. And so it varies by region. You go out to New England, there's lots of carpenters, and sometimes I'll say I want to go get a carpenter from New England because of what I'm doing, that's what I need. But you don't always have that luxury.
A couple questions. One, with all the structural issues with the SAMARA house, in the renovations, did you have to replace much glass? I know there was some specialized glass in some of those corners.
So the glass at SAMARA is all clear plate glass. And in order to dismantle all of that wooden glass stuff, I had to take it apart. In order to do repairs to the wood frames, I had to take it apart. Because all of that glass goes all the way down, like within a foot of the floor, current safety standards required me to replace all that glass. I have to install safety glazing. So the glass that's going back is a tempered glass as opposed to just plate glass. If it wasn't a location that required safety glazing, we would have reinstalled that glass. And in some windows that happens. But that's different coatings we can get around of. The safety glazing standards is a national standard and there's nobody to go appeal to. And so you end up replacing glass in that location. There wasn't anything unique about the glass, so to say. The corner glazing is a right detail of just butting two pieces of glass up against each other in the corner with no mullion, and we're replicating that detail when we replace it, but the actual glass in those areas that are full height will be done.
Yes, Bob, I want to tell you that I just learned a lot tonight about historic preservation. And I belong to a Catholic church in Indianapolis, Sacred Heart, and it was finished in 1891. We are facing a lot of repairs, starting with the roof. But the thing that concerns me now is you're all about preservation, which is what I would want for my church, but then there's just gotta be renovation sometimes. So how, as a congregation, do we go about preserving what we have and have a preservation and not just a renovation?
And I'll back up a little bit. A lot of the story I told is the exact same story for repair and renovation on a building if you're being a good steward to the building. You may not be doing the paint microscopy to understand the paint history and getting the color just right, but understanding the problems and what's really causing them and doing openings to correct the underlying issues and doing a series of samples and mock-ups so that the new work blends into the adjacent existing work as well as it can, that's just good practice. That doesn't have to be a National Historic Landmark. And the way, I hate to say it, but the way you actually achieve that is by hiring the design professionals up front that approach work that way.
Just hire his company.
There's a lot of people that do what I do. But if you hire someone that doesn't do that, they won't approach it that way. And it becomes a fight. Yeah.
What is the SAMARA project? Where is the house or whatever?
It's a house. It's now an interpreted house museum.
Okay.
It was built as a single family house, and when the original owner was at the end of his life, he donated it to a trust that was created to manage and interpret that house as a house museum.
Okay, where is that located?
What's the exact address?
1301 Woodward.
It's on the corner of
1301 Woodlawn.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
You know where the
SAMARA.
football practice field is, the big old practice field is right across.
And it should reopen up for tours around the world.
And it's a museum now?
Yeah, it's an interpretive museum. You can go there and take tours.
Oh, wow.
And,
Okay.
learn all about the history of the house, which I could not tell you.
Yeah, back to those mitered glass corners. So Dr. Christian always used to say that they were sealed with jewelry case cement. So one, I'm curious if that's true. And two, I'm curious if there is a new material. If so, is there a new material that has since been made that you will seal the mitered glass corners with now?
So I can't speak to whether they were sealed with jewelry case cement. I can tell you I've run into those windows a lot on Wright's work. If you go out to Taliesin or Taliesin West, there was nothing between them. So when Wright built them for himself, there was just air between them. Usually big gaps and water and air coming in.
Well, he didn't have a wall in his bedroom.
He didn't care. Other houses often use like a traditional glazing putty, which is a linseed oil-based putty. It was never done I've never seen it done when Wright, in an original Wright construction. Later modifications have sealed them with silicone sealant, trying to keep them really tight so they're basically.
Right.
Do you have much, in the historical projects that you do you have much preservation in them, or do you end up really just renovating them?
The work I do is almost all pure preservation.
Oh, really?
But our office is somewhat unique that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is neat about the story of the Christians and Mr. Wright is how he gave them a big drawing set and they executed it at the time. Right, is there anything in the project that you guys were able to do, be discovered, or details that you were able to then execute that maybe the Christians didn't get to, or corrects anything?
No, that wasn't really within the scope of what we were either researching and looking to do, or that we were doing. It was really dealing with the existing deteriorating conditions to get the house in a good long-term condition and correct the repairs that were needed.
What kind of a heating system did you decide upon?
So the two things, the original house had radiant floor heat in the concrete slabs. Unfortunately, it was built with copper piping, which copper pipe radiant heating in a concrete slab has a pretty limited lifespan. This was built in '59 and it's 2023, so that's about it. We are doing repairs to that. We did some tests, had an understanding of where the leaks were and how extensive they were, so we're using basically a leak stop material. If you have a leaky radio in your car, you pour that power stuff in there and it works good enough to sell it. It's kind of that kind of thing. And the idea is we can do that and let's get it working and see how long it will work for. Sometimes it works for a long time, sometimes it works long enough to sell. The forced air systems are more traditional. There's a small chiller pack that's out behind the tool shed. And I believe you guys have gas heat?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a gas-fired small furnace unit. In addition, so there's two systems. There's a radiant floor system, and then there's a forced air system that's supplementing that. The forced air system is an addition. It wasn't original. Yeah.
Question more about you and how we got to this. Any reason why you ended up with preservation or something that stimulated you to do this?
I'll tell you the story that should be told since I'm being recorded. I mean, everyone I know that's in this business that does it to the extent that I do has similar traits. We all have a combination of a real passion for history. Mine has a lot to do with biographies and history of place. Other people have architectural history, art history, but some passion of history, not always the same focus. Also, sort of this sleuth detective kind of person that wants to go and poke around all this stuff and take things apart and see how they really work. And a love for craft, and if you're really good at it, crafts people and artisans. I can't speak enough about the artisans and the craft people I work with. And I know enough on how to do every single thing they do. And I've done a little bit of everything they've done. And I can't do any of it any good. But I can have conversations with them and say, you're doing that wrong. They're gonna be like, I'm nuts. But if they, eventually they say, oh, if I do what he's asking me to, he'll be happy. So, which must be right. This is what's right. But it's often a combination of those things. And you just sort of fall in architecture. But you can take those skills and do a whole bunch of other things. You can be a great carpenter with all those skills. But I fell into architecture when I was 18, early on. That's what I've always done.
So you're talking about having to replace masonry units because the existing were small. When you do that and you took things down and you saved, do you intermix new and old, or do you keep the new?
We make that assessment on each project, and it's a combination of a couple things. How good of a match am I able to get? This project, we were lucky. I bought brick that's made by, I believe, the Belden Brick Company or somebody that makes thousands and thousands of bricks. When we did the Emil Bach house, we had bricks custom made. That's very hard to do. It's to the point where nobody will do it, at least they won't do it for me anymore. But it depends. If the match is perfect, we would usually blend it in. Here, we ended up blending it in. We debated it. We thought about using all of the new brick just on something like the lanai wall, and then using all the original bricks everywhere else. We balanced that decision, and it really becomes to what's going to be the least noticeable. Other places, if we have big shrubs or something, we will sometimes take apart brickwork that's in perfectly good condition and mine good original bricks at an area that's not visible, and then concentrate all the replacement stuff someplace that no one's ever going to see. So it varies. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that you worked on or did the Carson Perry Scott building in Chicago. Okay, when you started in with that, how much settlement did you have?
It depends on which part of the project. So we did multiple things. We recreated the cornice at the top floor of the building. There we did have to survey the whole building because I'm building a cornice and I need to know if it's perfectly level or is it go like this. And so we surveyed every column location and figured out what to do with the new stuff we were putting on it. And there was a variation around the whole block of maybe 2 to 3 inches from level. if I went out around it, that's not bad, because I think the total facade length on that is around 500 feet. So 2 or 3 inches up or down, here or there. When we did the cast iron was in horrible condition, and in our opinion, was in danger of falling off the building. And that was extremely out of place everywhere. There were entire bays, structural bays, like 20 feet by 2 stories of cast iron that had no attachment back to the building when we started. We didn't know that until we made all the holes and went to see how it was attached, and we said, oh, I'm gonna walk on the other side of the street until we're done. But it varied. But the cast iron was horrible. Yeah.
Well, the reason I was wondering, as a kid, of course, walking down the streets and the Christmas displays, I mean, you know, that was a must.
Yeah.
Parents were dragging us first, and then we were dragging them, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you at SAMARA, we had the same issue, because we were rebuilding all these terrace walls, and where did we rebuild them to? So we surveyed the house, and there was about 2 inches of settlement on the brick masonry that we were not fixing. So we raised up roofs a bit to make them work, not dead level, because if we did, water wouldn't pitch off the roof. But there was about 2 inches of settlement across the brick, and so I had to match that brick. So our new rebuild of those terrace walls is built at the same slope as the settlement that is on the house. It just won't move anymore.
How many bedrooms does the SAMARA house have?
3? How many bedrooms at SAMARA?
3 bedrooms, 2 baths, 2,200 square feet.
Any other questions?
Oh, and like who's, I'm not familiar, who is Wright? How does he?
So Frank Lloyd Wright is an architect. He's considered one of the most
First
important
architects?
He's an architect. He was one of the most important architects in U.S. architectural history, and internationally influential.
Oh, okay.
And he practiced from the late 1800s up until 1959 when he passed away.
Oh.
Did you have to do any repair on the copper cornice work?
I didn't have to do repair. I had to dismantle and reinstall some of it to do the structural repairs. There was areas we had to declad carefully and then put back.
Were the artisans and contractors that you used local, or a mix of local and experts?
All the contractors at SAMARA are local to this region.
Anybody from New England? No.
No. No. The architect from Chicago, the paint analysis materials expert is in Philadelphia, my structural engineer is in DC. But all the people that actually do work are local.
The one, you had a project that had no heating and no cooling system.
Mm-hmm.
So did you add that in, a cooling or heating system?
It had some, we added more, and we repaired the original. Yeah, so
okay.
it will be heated and cooled.
Oh, okay.
That it? Well, thank you everybody for coming out.